The contract Elvis Presley signed in 1969 with the International Hotel was for more money than any entertainer in history had ever been paid. But a single venomous clause, buried deep in the fine print, stipulated that if he missed even one performance for any reason, sickness, exhaustion, a broken heart, he would personally owe the hotel a crippling $1 million. So when the king of rock and roll strode onto that stage, bathed in the white-hot glare of 1,000 spotlights, was he taking a bow? Or was he stepping into the most glamorous, high-stakes prison cell ever built? It had all started with a resurrection. 1968, the year of fire and rebellion. And in the heart of it, Elvis, who had been lost for nearly a decade in a Hollywood fever dream of bad scripts and forgettable songs, was suddenly, shockingly, alive again. The television special stripped him bare, ditching the race cars and the clam-baked queens. And what was left was the man himself, a primal force in black leather. He was hungry. He was dangerous. The fire that had changed the world was burning once more in his eyes. And in the desert, they smelled money. Colonel Tom Parker, the carnival barker-turned-manager who saw his client not as an artist, but as a magnificent, cash-producing attraction, saw the neon glow of Las Vegas not as a creative dead end, but as a throne room. This was the town where legends were preserved in amber, where the fire of youth could be traded for the steady, reliable heat of a long-term contract. It was a place with no clocks and no last calls. A perfect, perpetual motion machine for profit. The International Hotel was the newest jewel in the city's crown, the biggest hotel and casino in the world. Its owner, the formidable Kirk Kerkorian, wasn't just building a resort. He was building an empire, and every empire needs a king. Parker arranged the meeting. The numbers they discussed were astronomical, dizzying. A 4-week engagement, 2 shows a night, 7 nights a week, 57 shows in total. The offer was a validation, a coronation. After years of being a cinematic joke, Elvis was being told he was the most valuable performer on the planet. He signed. The flashbulbs of the press conference were blinding. The champagne was cold. In that moment, Elvis Presley felt invincible. He had survived the army, he had survived Hollywood, and now he had come back from the dead to conquer the desert. But while the king celebrated, his father, Vernon, a man who understood the grim reality of a ledger book better than the fantasy of a stage, saw the truth hidden in the language of the contract. He saw the schedule. 2 shows a night. The first, a dinner show for the high rollers and the tourists. The second, a midnight show for the true denizens of the night, the gamblers and the dreamers. Every single night, for a month. Vernon warned his son, his voice low and urgent, that this wasn't a concert tour. It was a factory assembly line, a relentless grind designed to bleed every last drop of energy from its star performer, a pace no man, not even Elvis, could possibly sustain. But Elvis, high on the narcotic of his own comeback, just smiled. The machine was now in motion. The opening night was July 31st, 1969. It was an earthquake. He didn't just sing. He commanded. He prowled the stage, a panther in a white jumpsuit, channeling all the pent-up energy of his lost years into a 2-hour spectacle of pure, unadulterated rock and roll. He was backed by a full orchestra and a gospel choir, but all eyes were on him. He was funny. He was self-deprecating. And when he sang, he tore his soul open for 2,000 strangers a night. The critics, so eager to dismiss him as a relic, were stunned into submission. They called it the greatest comeback in the history of entertainment. But after the final bow, after the roar of the crowd faded, there was only the silence of the penthouse suite on the 30th floor. The adrenaline, a tidal wave that carried him through the performance, would crash violently, leaving him stranded and hollow. The stage was a sliver of reality in a world that had become increasingly artificial. The suite was his sanctuary and his cell. The city of perpetual light outside his window began to warp his sense of time. Days bled into nights. Tuesday felt like Saturday. The only clock that mattered was the one counting down to showtime. The routine was a slow-acting poison. He would sleep until late afternoon, awakened not by the sun, but by his inner circle, the Memphis Mafia. They would kill the empty hours with idle chatter, karate practice, and rented movies. Then, the preparation would begin. The vocal warm-ups, the ritual of squeezing into the jumpsuit, the nervous energy building into a fever pitch until he was practically vibrating with it. Then, the explosion of the show, and then the crash. Sleep became an elusive enemy, a prize to be won only with a chemical cocktail of pills prescribed by doctors who were all too willing to keep the king happy and functional. What the world didn't know was that the contract extended beyond the stage. The hotel wasn't just paying for his voice. They were buying his very presence. A clause in the agreement stipulated that he had to remain on the hotel property for the entire duration of his engagement. He was, for all intents and purposes, under house arrest. His friends and family could come and go, flying in and out of the city's airport, but the king was a permanent resident of the International Hotel. The friendly security guards posted at his elevator were there as much to keep people out as they were to keep him in. They were his protectors, and they were his wardens. Las Vegas was a city built on illusion, and he was now its grandest one. The isolation was profound. Surrounded by his entourage, he had never been more alone. The opulent suite, with its panoramic views of the desert, began to feel smaller and smaller, the walls closing in. He was a prisoner in a palace, looking down on a kingdom he was forbidden to enter. The relentless pressure of being Elvis, a product, an icon, 24 hours a day, began to chip away at the man underneath. His body began to betray him. The dry desert air, recycled through the hotel's massive air conditioning system, was brutal on his throat. He developed what the Vegas veterans called desert throat, a persistent, painful inflammation that made singing an act of sheer will. The 2-show-a-night schedule was physically punishing, an athletic feat that left him drained, bruised, and utterly exhausted. The jumpsuits, drenched in sweat, would weigh nearly 30 pounds by the end of a show. He was losing his voice, he was losing his strength, and he was losing his mind. The solution was always the same. A doctor would be summoned to the suite, a man with a black bag full of miracles and poisons. To get him on stage, he needed uppers, shots of B12 laced with amphetamines. To get him through the pain, he needed painkillers. To get him to sleep, he needed downers. This wasn't the hedonistic excess of a rock star. This was a grim medical necessity, a maintenance schedule required to keep the million-dollar machinery of Elvis Presley running on time. To fulfill the contract, soon, the public began to notice a change. He was gaining weight. His movements, once so fluid and explosive, became sluggish. The tabloids whispered of a monstrous appetite, of fried peanut butter and banana sandwiches, of a man letting himself go. They blamed his southern roots, his lazy indulgence, but they were wrong. Backstage, a far more sinister story was unfolding. To combat the chronic swelling in his throat and vocal cords, Elvis had begun receiving regular cortisone shots. The drug worked, reducing the inflammation enough for him to sing, but its side effects were devastating. It ravaged his metabolism. It caused bloating, water retention, and dramatic weight gain. The man the world saw as growing fat was, in reality, a man being slowly poisoned by the very medicine that allowed him to walk on stage each night. The duality of his existence was a psychological torture chamber. On stage, under the lights, he was a god. He could hold 2,500 people in the palm of his hand, making them laugh, making them cry, making them scream his name. He was powerful, he was loved, he was in control. It was the only place he felt truly alive. But the moment the lights went down, he was just a man again. A profoundly lonely man, pacing the 31st floor of a hotel that owned him. He began spending his waking hours off stage reading esoteric books on religion and the afterlife, searching for meaning, for an escape that wasn't pharmaceutical. His relationship with the audience began to curdle. At first, their adoration was the fuel that kept him going. But after hundreds of shows, the faces began to blur. The roar of the crowd, once a sound of love, started to sound like the clanging of prison bars. The endless wave of demand for a song, for a scarf, for a piece of him, became suffocating. Then came the darkness. The fame that had built his prison also made him a target. Death threats became a terrifyingly frequent part of the Vegas routine. Anonymous callers would phone the hotel, promising to shoot him on stage. The FBI was called in. The hotel tightened its security, which only served to further isolate him, sealing him off from the world. His gilded cage now had armed guards. The fear was not an abstraction. In August of 1973, federal agents uncovered a credible plot to kidnap Elvis for a massive ransom. The threat was deemed so real, so immediate, that for several performances, he walked on stage with a loaded Derringer pistol hidden in each of his custom-made boots. He would stand there in his angelic white jumpsuit, a sequined deity, singing tender ballads like "Can't Help Falling in Love" to a mesmerized audience, while his hands twitched, ready to draw a weapon. He scanned the sea of faces in the dark, no longer looking for adoration, but for the glint of a gun barrel. The stage was no longer his sanctuary. It had become the kill zone. The pressure began to crack the facade. He started to unravel on stage. The famous Elvis monologues, once charming and funny, became strange, paranoid ramblings about numerology, federal agents, and his own mortality. He would lecture the audience, his voice slurring from the medication. It wasn't showmanship. It was a raw, unfiltered cry for help, broadcast to thousands of people who thought it was all just part of the act. They laughed and applauded, not realizing they were witnessing a man coming apart at the seams in real time. Colonel Parker's response was not concern for his client's health. It was damage control for his brand. The only problem he saw was a potential breach of contract. A missed show was $1 million liability. So the solution was always more. More doctors, more pills to counteract the other pills, more pressure to get back on stage and deliver the fantasy. The show, above all else, must go on. The contract was iron. One night, the exhaustion was absolute. The cocktail of medications had left him in a fog, a waking dream from which he couldn't escape. He sat in the wings, the heavy, sequined cape draped over his shoulders feeling like a lead blanket. He could hear the familiar, thunderous opening bars of his theme music, also Sprach Zarathustra, the sound that was supposed to ignite the fire. But tonight, it sounded like a funeral dirge. It was the sound of the great, unstoppable machine cranking up again, the machine that was grinding him into dust. He looked over at his friend and bodyguard, Red West, a man who had been with him since the beginning. The roar from the other side of the curtain was deafening, a beast demanding to be fed. Elvis's lips barely moved, his voice a dry, desperate whisper, a secret passed between two men in the final moments before the sacrifice. "Red," he said, his eyes locking with his friend's. "They're not cheering for me anymore." He swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tight. "They're cheering for the ghost." Red West stared back, his own face a mask of concern. But what could he say? He was just a bodyguard, a friend. He couldn't stop the machine. No one could. He gave a slight, helpless nod, and watched as Elvis Presley, the ghost in the white jumpsuit, turned and walked into the blinding light, the roar of the crowd washing over him like a tidal wave. But what if the ghost had a plan? What if the man who felt like he was already dead was secretly plotting his own disappearance? We think of Elvis's final years as a slow, inevitable decline, a tragedy playing out in plain sight. But the truth is far more complex and far more deliberate. Because while Elvis was dying on stage, he was also meticulously planning a secret second act. It was the one performance the world would never see. It had no code name, but in his own mind he might have called it Operation Fountain Pen. The fountain pen was the tool of his fame, the instrument used to sign the contracts that trapped him, and the autographs that connected him to his fans. Now, he would use it to sign his own release form. The plan was audacious in its simplicity, to systematically siphon off millions of dollars, in cash, from his own earnings before the colonel or his business managers could touch it. He would use a trusted few, people outside the Memphis Mafia's inner circle, to create a network of safe deposit boxes and hidden accounts. He wasn't just hoarding cash. He was studying. Those esoteric books weren't just about the afterlife. They were about new lives. He read about men who had successfully faked their own deaths, about remote islands with no extradition treaties, about how to create new identities from scratch. Was this the rambling of a man lost in a pharmaceutical haze? Or was it the desperate research of a prisoner planning the ultimate escape? He started making strange requests. He wanted to go on long, unscheduled drives, deep into the Nevada desert, with just one driver. He would have the car stop, and he would just get out and stare at the horizon for an hour, saying nothing. His companions thought he was communing with some spiritual force. In reality, he was scouting. He was looking for a place where a ghost could disappear. He was trying to remember what it felt like to be a man standing on the earth, not a god floating on a stage. The goal wasn't just to escape the colonel. It was to escape Elvis Presley. His dream was to end up somewhere no one knew his name, somewhere he could walk into a diner and order a cheeseburger without causing a riot, maybe open a small karate dojo, live a quiet life. He wanted to get back to the one thing that had been stolen from him. An ordinary Tuesday. But a gilded cage is still a cage, and this one had many, many guards. The plan was too big, too complex to keep entirely to himself, and in his isolation he made a fatal mistake. He began to trust the wrong people. He confided bits and pieces of his plan to members of his own entourage. He saw them as brothers, men who had been with him from the start, who he believed would follow him to the ends of the earth. He didn't realize that their loyalty was no longer just to the man. It was to the lifestyle. The private jets, the diamond rings, the reflected glory. Their entire world was funded by the machine he was trying to dismantle. They saw a man spiraling, talking crazy about disappearing, and they panicked. In their minds, they were staging an intervention, a wake-up call. They teamed up with his cousin, Dave Hebler, and decided to write a book, a tell-all exposé that would lay bare the dark reality of his life. The drugs, the paranoia, the rages. Their stated goal was to shock him into getting help, to save him from himself. But in releasing his darkest secrets to the world, they also destroyed the one thing he had left: the possibility of escape. You can't disappear when the whole world is suddenly looking for you, watching your every move, waiting for the next lurid detail. The news of the book, which he learned about just months before its publication in 1977, was not a wake-up call. It was a death sentence. The men he had considered family, the men who had stood between him and a violent world, had just turned on him. They had taken his private pain and sold it as public entertainment. The escape plan was shattered. The trust was gone. The last door had just been locked from the outside. Now the isolation was complete. He retreated to the upstairs of Graceland, a sanctuary that had become his final prison. The ghost he felt on stage had now followed him home. The world outside the gates was no longer a place he could dream of rejoining. It was a hostile territory, filled with people who now knew his shame. And Colonel Parker? He used the betrayal to his advantage. "See?" he would tell Elvis. "I'm the only one you can trust. I'm the only one who has never left you." He tightened his grip, reinforcing the idea that only he could protect Elvis from a cruel and unforgiving world. With escape no longer an option, Elvis turned inward, to the only place he had any control left: his own body and mind. The self-destruction accelerated. The reading became more frantic, a desperate search for a spiritual exit, since the physical one was now barred. The food was no longer for pleasure, but for comfort, a way to fill the cavernous emptiness inside him. The pills were no longer just to manage pain or get him on stage. They were the tools to blur the edges of a reality that had become unbearable. Yet even in this final, dark chapter, the fire had not gone out completely. There were flickers of the man he wanted to be. One night, in a fit of rage and clarity, he picked up the phone. He fired Colonel Parker. It wasn't the first time, but this time, he followed it up with other calls. He called his old bandmates. He called producers in Hollywood. He started talking about a new project, a passion project. He wanted to produce a film himself, a serious drama about the martial arts called The New Gladiator. He began planning a new tour, not the Vegas spectacle, but something raw and real. A European tour, something the Colonel had always forbidden. He wanted to go to England, to Japan. He wanted to stand on a stage with just a small band, no jumpsuits, no scarves, and just sing. Sing the blues, sing gospel, sing the songs that had moved him as a boy in Tupelo. He was trying to find his way back, not just to a quiet life, but to the music, to the art that had been his first and truest love. But the escape plan had failed for a reason far more profound than betrayal. The prison wasn't just Las Vegas or the Colonel or his fame. The prison was his own body. The years of prescription drug abuse, supervised and enabled by a rotating cast of doctors, had waged a silent, devastating war on his internal systems. He was suffering from an enlarged heart, high blood pressure, a painfully diseased colon, and early-stage liver failure. The man who looked merely overweight was, in fact, chronically ill. He couldn't escape because he was too tired to run. He couldn't start a new life because his current one was physically shutting down. Every moment of clarity, every burst of creative energy, was paid for with days of agonizing pain and debilitating fatigue. He was a king trapped within a crumbling empire of his own flesh and blood. The tragedy of Elvis Presley is not that he died, it's that he was already gone. And in his final year, he knew it. He was just a man trying to find a comfortable way to say goodbye to a world that would never, ever let him go. On his last night on Earth, August 16, 1977, he wasn't preparing for a show. He was just a man trying to get through the night. He played racquetball with his cousin. He sat at the piano in his private lounge and sang. The last song he ever sang wasn't one of his thunderous hits. It was a quiet, soulful country ballad, Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. A song about loss, about memory, about a final farewell. After the music, he retreated to his bedroom. He couldn't sleep. A common torment. He picked up a book, not about fame or fortune, but about the Shroud of Turin, continuing his search for a faith that could make sense of his extraordinary, painful life. He took his prescribed packets of nighttime medication, meant to finally bring him the peace of unconsciousness. He then took the book with him into his bathroom, his most private sanctuary within the sanctuary of Graceland, to read until sleep finally came. It never did. The ghost in the jumpsuit had finally given up the ghost. But his story, the real story, was just beginning to surface. Because what the world discovered in the aftermath of his death would be even more shocking than the life he had lived. The king was dead, but his secrets were very much alive. As the world mourned, his family faced a more immediate and terrifying reality. The king of rock and roll, the man who had earned hundreds of millions of dollars, was nearly broke. His estate was worth less than $1 million, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. How could this be possible? Where did it all go? The answer would unravel the single greatest betrayal in music history, a betrayal hidden not in secret ledgers, but in plain sight, on a single, devastating piece of paper. Everyone knew about the infamous 50-50 split with Colonel Parker. But what if that was a lie? What if the fine print revealed something so predatory it essentially made Elvis Presley an employee in his own life? That fine print wasn't a partnership agreement. It was a deed of ownership. Over the decades, Colonel Parker had systematically amended his management contract until he controlled not just Elvis's career, but his very identity. It wasn't a 50% commission on profits. It was total control of the revenue. Elvis Presley, the biggest star on the planet, was essentially on an allowance, paid by a company that owned his name, his image, and his voice. The betrayal was so complete, so audacious, it was almost invisible. This one devastating secret explains everything. The reason he never toured the world? The colonel was an illegal immigrant, a man named Andreas van Kwijk, living in America without a passport. He couldn't leave the country, so he made sure Elvis couldn't either. The endless string of terrible movies wasn't a creative choice. It was Parker liquidating his asset for quick, guaranteed cash. Elvis was tethered to a carnival barker who saw him not as an artist, but as the main attraction in his one-man circus. The tragedy of Elvis Presley is not that a corporation or a manager stole his money. It's that they stole his art. They stole his ambition. They took a revolutionary force of nature, a voice that blended the sacred and the profane, and they packaged it into a safe, repeatable, and endlessly profitable product. He was a king who ruled over a kingdom he was never allowed to explore. His true potential was the fortune that was truly lost, a treasure we can only glimpse in the raw fire of his early work and the desperate passion of his final comeback. But a voice like that can't be boxed up forever. In the end, the music escaped. It outlived the jumpsuits, the movies, and the men who sought to control it. It broke free from the gilded cage of Graceland and found a home in the hearts of millions. It is the sound of rebellion. It is the sound of love. It is the sound of a poor boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, who reached for heaven and, for a fleeting moment, touched it. That is the legacy that could never be signed away. His life is a cautionary tale, a grand American tragedy written in gold records and prescription bottles. But his music is an eternal gift. It reminds us that even in the darkest room, a single voice can light up the world. The king is dead, but the song plays on, forever. To hear more of the stories behind the songs and uncover the truth behind the legend, subscribe to the channel that keeps the music alive. Subscribe to forever_Elvis_story.